Before Rome fell, Europe's world was already shifting. Empires cracked, roads, laws, and loyalties unraveled. What replaced empire? Castles, oaths, survival, feudalism. In minutes, meet its rise and its lasting legacy. Rome did not crumble in a single fiery cataclysm. Its end was not a sudden event, but a slow, grinding decay that stretched across generations. Imagine a grand tapestry, woven with threads of law-legion language, slowly unraveling thread by thread. The great stone roads, once arteries of commerce and military might, fell into disrepair. Aqueducts that carried life-giving water to bustling cities cracked and went dry. The Pax Romana, that long peace enforced by the eagle standards of the legions, became a distant memory. This slow collapse left a gaping void, a vacuum of power across the European continent. Into this chaotic emptiness, a new order had to be born, not from a grand design, but from the raw necessity of survival. Without the central authority of an emperor, people looked for protection closer to home. Local strongmen, warlords, landowners began to carve out their own domains. They offered safety in a dangerous world, but that safety came at a steep price. This was the fertile ground from which feudalism sprouted. It was a pragmatic system, a response to a world where travel was perilous and distant authority was meaningless. People traded their freedom for security, their labor for a patch of land to farm, and a wall to hide behind when raiders appeared on the horizon. This new world was smaller, more fragmented, and built on personal bonds rather than abstract citizenship. The memory of Rome, however, did not vanish entirely. It haunted the medieval imagination, a ghost of a lost golden age of unity and order. Kings popes would later invoke its legacy, styling themselves as new emperors, seeking to rebuild what had been lost. But the immediate reality for most was a world defined by the local lord and the nearest fortified wall. The grand, sweeping vision of a universal empire was replaced by the urgent, practical need for a strong arm and a defensible position. Feudalism was the system that grew in the long, dark shadow cast by Rome's colossal fall, a world built piece by piece from the rubble of a shattered civilization. The transition was not uniform, and it was certainly not peaceful. It was a messy, violent process of adaptation. Small conflicts erupted constantly as these new local powers tested their boundaries and vied for control over land and the people who worked it. The very concept of a nation-state as we know it today dissolved into a complex mosaic of personal loyalties and overlapping allegiances. A man's world shrank to the size of his lord's domain. This was the brutal, necessary bedrock upon which the next 1,000 years of European history would be built, a system forged in the fires of chaos and held together by the simple, powerful bonds of oath and steel. The structure of feudal government is best pictured as a great pyramid of power, built on a foundation of land and loyalty. At the very peak sat the king, a figure who, in theory, owned all the land in his kingdom. But a king could not rule a vast territory alone. He granted large parcels of land, called fiefs, to his most powerful nobles and bishops. In exchange for this land, they swore an oath of fealty, a sacred promise to provide the king with soldiers and counsel, often sealed with a holy relic. This bond of personal loyalty was the glue that held the kingdom together, far more potent than any written law. Below the great lords were their own vassals, the knights, professional warriors of the age. A lord would grant a knight a smaller piece of land, enough to support him, his family, and his expensive military equipment. In return, the knight owed his lord military service, typically for 40 days a year. At the very bottom were the serfs and peasants, not granted land but tied to it, working the fields for the lord. They had little freedom and few rights, but received the lord's protection from bandits and rival armies. Beside this structure stood the church, a parallel pyramid of power, with the Pope at its head, wielding spiritual influence and temporal influence. At the heart of each lord's domain stood his castle. These stone behemoths were more than military fortresses, an administrative centre and an economic centre. Their high walls, deep moats and imposing gatehouses were built to withstand siege. From within these walls, the lord held court, dispensed justice and settled disputes. The castle was the government building, the courthouse and the police station, a symbol of order in a world on the edge of violence. The castle was also a hub of economic activity, a secure warehouse for the region's surplus, grain, wine, livestock. Artisans worked inside, blacksmiths, carpenters, weavers. Markets sprang up outside the gates, traders and local farmers buying and selling under the lord's guards. The castle was the engine of the local economy, a magnet for people and commerce, and the anchor that secured the lord's grip on his land and his subjects. The knight was the iron fist, the mobile instrument of force that made a lord's authority real. The journey to knighthood was a long and arduous one, beginning in early childhood. A boy of noble birth would be sent away to another lord's castle to serve as a page, learning courtly manners and basic combat skills. As a teenager, he became a squire, the personal attendant to a knight. He cared for his master's armor and horses, followed him into battle, and learned the brutal realities of warfare firsthand. Only after years of this rigorous apprenticeship, upon proving his courage and skill, would a squire be dubbed a knight in a solemn ceremony. Clad in a suit of plate armor that could weigh over 50 pounds, the knight was the medieval equivalent of a walking tank. His primary weapons were the lance, used to charge on horseback, and the longsword for close-quarters combat. This equipment was incredibly expensive, as was the powerful warhorse, or destrier, bred for strength and courage in battle. This is why knighthood was restricted to the landowning class. Only they could afford the immense cost of being a professional warrior. The knight's role was to enforce his lord's will, defend the castle, and fight in the king's wars when called upon. Guiding the knight's conduct, at least in theory, was the code of chivalry. This was a complex set of ideals that prized bravery, honor, loyalty, and courtesy. A chivalrous knight was expected to protect the weak and defenseless, show mercy to a defeated foe, and treat noble ladies with respect. The songs of troubadours and epic poems celebrated these virtues, creating a romanticized image of the perfect warrior. Chivalry was a powerful cultural force, an attempt to civilize a violent warrior class and give a higher purpose to their bloody profession. It was the conscience of the feudal military system. In reality, however, there was often a wide chasm between the chivalric ideal and the brutal practice of medieval warfare. Many knights were little more than hired thugs, fighting for plunder and personal gain. The rules of chivalry often applied only to fellow nobles. Peasants and townspeople could be treated with ruthless cruelty. Sieges were grim affairs involving starvation and slaughter, and the aftermath of a battle could be a horrific scene of looting and vengeance. The knight was a paradox, a figure of both romantic heroism and terrifying violence, the protector and the oppressor, embodying the deep contradictions of the age he served. Kingdoms were not static entities, they were constantly shifting, growing, and falling. The most dramatic way to take a kingdom was through outright conquest, culminating in a siege. An attacking army would surround a castle, cutting off its supplies of food and water. They might build massive siege engines, trebuchets to hurl boulders at the walls, or construct siege towers to get soldiers over the ramparts. Miners could dig tunnels, called saps, to collapse a section of the wall from beneath. Yet, often the most powerful weapon was hunger. Starving a castle's defenders into submission was a slow but brutally effective tactic. However, power changed hands through more subtle means than open warfare. Strategic marriages were a primary tool of statecraft. A well-planned wedding could unite two powerful families, merge two neighboring territories, and secure a dynasty's future without a single drop of blood being shed. A princess's hand in marriage could be worth more than an entire army. Betrayal was another common path to power. A disgruntled lord could be bribed or persuaded to switch his allegiance, opening a castle's gates from within or turning his forces against his former master at a critical moment in battle. Winning the loyalty of a rival's key vassals was often the surest way to topple him from his throne. If we hold up the feudal world as a mirror to our own, we can see surprising reflections. The rigid hierarchy of king, lord and vassal finds an echo in the modern corporation, with its CEO, regional vice presidents and employees. The Lord's Castle, a centre of power, wealth and security, can be compared to today's tech giants and their vast data centres, which control the flow of information and commerce. The Knights, the specialised enforcers of the system, have their modern counterparts in national militaries and private security firms. The serfs, tied to the land, might be seen in the precarious gig economy workers, dependent on platforms they do not own or control. History teaches us that no system lasts forever. The signs of change are all around us today, just as they were in the late Middle Ages. New centres of power are emerging in the digital realm, challenging the authority of traditional nation-states. As we navigate this transition, the past offers a crucial lesson. Change can be managed with care, or it can descend into chaos. By recognizing where power is concentrating now, in our new digital castles, we can work to build systems of accountability, create safety nets for our modern peasants, and ensure that power is distributed more equitably. The future is not yet written, and by learning from the fall of one world and the rise of another, we can build the next one with greater wisdom and hope.